Good morning, friends and historians. I am so delighted to see you all, and this is a wonderful time that we will be discussing one of the most important issues, and I'm sure you'll be able to understand some of the significant aspects of Indian history, particularly modern Indian history. So, the subject of discussion today is British Conquest and Consolidation. I'm sure you must have heard a large amount of details about history, and you also, I'm sure, would have read something interesting, and you must have watched some documentaries about the British Conquest and Consolidation. So, here we will be discussing today one of the most important issues which hardly received the attention of professional historians, right? So, in this lecture, we will be exploring some of the important areas of research which has not been studied in detail by historians. Okay, so why we need to study British conquest and consolidation? What is the significance of studying history? What is the use of studying history? So it's very important. I always try to recollect one of the most popular black nationalists in Africa, Marcus Garvey, right? And he quoted that people without the knowledge of their history and culture are like trees with no roots. I repeat once again, this is a very thought-provoking statement made by Marcus Garvey. So he said, people without the knowledge of their history and culture are like a tree without roots. Now the question is, some of you must have read a wide range of literature and others still are reading, and some of us really have no idea about our own history, our own tradition, our own heritage. So I think this discussion today that we will be having will be able to explain some of the important aspects of historical process, particularly in modern India. So when we think of British conquest and consolidation, there are a range of historians who have studied both in India and Britain and other countries. So always you find two predominant narratives about the conquest and consolidation of Britain, right? So there are two important historical interpretations, broadly speaking. So you always have two schools of thought, like Whig historians and Tory school of thought. And Whig historians mostly, including Thomas Macaulay, Herbert Butterfield, and so on and so forth. And these Whig historians continue to claim that the empire was the direct and deserved result of Britain's technological and moral superiority, right? So this is a claim, because the British was able to consolidate and conquer a considerable part of the world, and this was historical reality according to them, largely because of their technological and moral superiority. Right, this is a debatable issue. And therefore, they were always, proud in claiming that a small kingdom had amazed such a huge empire. So, this is again a debatable issue. And you also need to know, on the contrary, you also have historians like Edward Said, and in his historical work, Orientalism in 1978, and he always criticized that the Britain was able to capture a considerable part of the region in the world largely through its cultural imperialism. So therefore, this is you have another school of thought, how therefore cultural imperialism therefore prompted the British to capture a sizable geographical areas in the world. And the third school of thought, mostly you find they point out the positive legacy of British rule. Positive legacy. It could be a formal systems of governance, law, and education, as well as the development infrastructure like railways. So therefore, you also have different schools of thought how Britain was able to consolidate and conquer a considerable part of the country. Now, our question here is, how did they do it here in India? Right? So, here in this lecture, we will be discussing how the British power, can be studied in India, particularly in the case of Bengal, in the case of Mysore, and in the case of Marathas, and finally how they were able to consolidate their power in Punjab. So our case study will be based on these four important regions. One is Bengal, and second is Mysore, and third is Marathas, and fourth is Punjab. So I will try to explain how the British power needs to be studied, therefore, critically and historically. So coming to the core aspect of the discussion, the conquest and consolidation of Bengal in India. And most importantly, when we think of Bengal, as historian Om Prakash, in his important article, Bullion for Goods, International Trade and the Economy of Early 18th Century Bengal. This article was published in ISHR in 1976. And he makes a very, very interesting argument saying that Bengal or the Bengal region included the territory now covered by Bangladesh and the Indian states of West Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. So let us be very clear, when we talk of Bengal, we are talking exactly the regions covered, the modern Bangladesh, Indian states of West Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. And the second important aspect, Bengal was important always in the history of India, largely because it became one of the 12 imperial provinces of the Mughals in the 17th century. And most important personality that we can think of, Murshid Quli Khan, was made Diwan of Bengal by Aurangzeb himself. And in fact, at the time of Aurangzeb's death, he also therefore increased his power and position in Bengal, and he became a governor of Bengal in 1717, and he transferred the capital, therefore, from Dhaka to Murshidabad. So this is a very, very important aspect that we need to remember. And this is wonderful to know that historian S.N. Sen, in his book, argues that Murshid Quli Khan, was able to establish his capital, Murshidabad, and it was and efficient financial and revenue administration. So it's a very important how Murshid Quli Khan therefore played very, very important role. And here he was the first Bengal ruler who established a landed aristocracy in Bengal. So this is also another important thing that we need to remember, how this historical significance of Bengal therefore started improving, slowly and gradually. And this is very, very important. And Murshid Quli Khan's position therefore was further strengthened by Cornwallis, and who was, as we all know, the commander-in-chief of the British India, and who introduced permanent revenue settlement in 1793. This is a very, very well documented. So, for example, for collection of revenue, Murshid Quli Khan divided the entire Bengal region into 13 circles. That's also very, very important, how therefore there was a well or efficient financial administration under the leadership of Murshid Quli Khan. And it's another important thing, though virtually independent, always remember, though virtually independent, Murshid Quli Khan and his successors continued to send revenues to Mughal Emperor. Okay, so we are not suggesting therefore Bengal was completely an independent state. Rather, we are suggesting that despite the fact that Bengal was virtually independent, Murshid Khan and his successors therefore were expected to send revenues to Mughal Emperor on a regular basis. That's a very, very important aspect. And it's very, very important to note historian P.J. Marshall. So P.J. Marshall has done a very detailed study on Bengal, and for example, he in his book, The Bengal, the British Bridgehead, argues Murshid Khan was the architect of autonomous Bengal. Right? This is a very, very, I think, important development as far as the Bengal province is concerned. And similarly, you also have historian John Richards in his book, The Mughal Empire, argues that Murshid Quli Khan's success was based on his loyalty and obedience in his role as a careful fiscal manager. You see, this is a statement comes from John Richards about Murshid Quli Khan's very, very efficient governance system. And similarly, Murshid Khan also was able to retain his power because he continued to be faithful in his revenue to the Mughals. That's also another important thing that we need to remember, how there was therefore a kind of informal relationship between Bengal and the Mughals. So we are not suggesting therefore Bengal was completely independent, right? So the available historical literature suggests therefore the Murshid Quli Khan and his successors continued to be faithful in terms of revenues to the Mughal emperor, and whom he identified as a cash-starved monarch. Always it's fascinating to understand such a very, very significant term. So this is a term used by Murshid Quli Khan himself. So he identified the Mughal ruler as a cash-starved monarch. So we are talking obviously the weak and the late Mughal rulers. Obviously, after Aurangzeb's death. And similarly, one important thing that I wanted to discuss, between 1712 and his death period, which is 1727, during the reign of Muhammad Shah, the Mughal ruler, Murshid Khan sent an average of 10.5 million rupees per year to Delhi. You see, this is a very, very important thing. So how, as a ruler who was identified, Murshid Quli Khan as a cash-starved monarch, therefore was in desperate need for financial assistance. And this financial assistance therefore came predominantly from Murshid Khan himself and the Bengal province. So These important developments, therefore, we need to study very, very critically and historically. And one thing that I wanted to discuss is the economic reasons, therefore, played a very, very important role, and which attracted a great deal of attention of the British to have an eye for Bengal province, right? So this is a very, very important, and it is in this context we need to see the objective of colonial consolidation in Bengal, right? So there are many historians who have studied why Britain had an eye on Bengal. For example, one of the recent studies that we can think of is Michael Fisher. Michael Fisher, in his book, The Politics of the British Annexation of India, the politics of British annexation in India, he argues that the predominant motive of the British in Bengal was to control the resources of rich province. So it's very, very important. It's not politics, it's not something else, it's the economy, therefore, attracted the attention of the British. So the predominant motive, the primary motive, objective of the British in Bengal particularly was to control the resources of rich province. So Bengal was therefore the most successful economic region in India in the 18th century. Okay, this is also very, very important thing to be noted. And secondly, when I was reading some of the important works of Geoffrey Williamson, Geoffrey Williamson's work is very, very important. Anyone who reads modern India, particularly, I think, has to read Geoffrey Williamson. Otherwise, our understanding of history will be, in a way, incomplete. It's my understanding. So Geoffrey Williamson, in his important work, India's deindustrialization in the 17th and 18th century, argues. It's a very clear and a thought-provoking statement. And I think when I was reading, I was really speechless, to understand the reality of the 17th and 18th century. So what is the argument? Geoffrey Williamson argues that India accounted for 25% of the world economic production. I repeat, India accounted for 25% of the world economic production in the 18th century, and deindustrialization reduced India's share of the world economy from 25% in 1700 to 4.2% in 1950. This is not an exaggerated statement by a historian like Geoffrey Williamson. Remember, India's economy, or the contribution of world economic production in the world in the 18th century is 25% in the 18th century. But because of deindustrialization, the share was reduced considerably to just a single digit, 4.2 in 1950. Now let me ask you the question, what do you think the contribution of England to the world economy? Whether it's 10% or 20% or 30%? England's contribution to world economy, according to Geoffrey Williamson, was just 1.9% in the 18th century. Is it believable? Of course it is. We are not therefore exaggerating here. What I suggest, what I try to explain is purely from well-documented historical sources. England's contribution, therefore, to the world economy was just 1.9% in the 18th century, whereas India's contribution to the world economy was 25%. Just imagine the yawning gap between England, the so-called colonizer, and India, the colonized. Okay, this is a very, very important aspect that we need to remember. And secondly, as C.A. Bailey argues, remember always I'm talking in the context of economy, how economy always therefore played a very significant role for the conquest and consolidation of Britain, by Britain, of India. So C.A. Bailey therefore argues, Mughal emperor, there, as I told you in the beginning, there was always a kind of informal relationship between the Mughals and the Bengal rulers. So as C.A. Bailey argues that the Mughal emperors therefore started allowing the East India Company to have a kind of free trade in Bengal after getting a small amount of money. As I told you, again Murshid Quli Khan was the one who used the term cash-starved monarch. Obviously, any cash-starved monarch would be in desperate need for. So, according to C.A. Bailey, since 1717, the East India Company therefore enjoyed great privileges in Bengal. Okay, this is a very, very important aspect that we need to remember. How, therefore, there was the close, a kind of informal relationship between the Bengal rulers and the Mughals and the British East India Company, therefore, need to be understood critically. So accordingly, the East India Company was entitled to trade in Bengal without paying the normal customs duty, popularly known as firman. Okay, so therefore this firman was misused by the East India Company. Remember always. So this firman was misused by the East India Company, and which obviously led to tension between the company and the Nawabs of Bengal. What kind of misuse that we need to remember? How did the British East India Company therefore desperately misuse this provision which was given for some other reason, but they have misused it for their own vested interest? And the East India Company therefore similarly started building factories in Calcutta. The Nawabs of Bengal therefore prevented the English and the French from fortifying their factories at Calcutta, because always there was conflicts and confrontations between English and French, as we all know. And one thing I wanted to emphasize here is actually there are two Fort Williams. When we think of Fort William, normally we assume that there is only one Fort William, but the available historical literature suggests that there are two Fort Williams. Obviously, I'll explain. The original Fort William was built in the year around 1696 by the British East India Company under the instruction of Sir John Goldsborough, and he was actually a sea captain and administrator of East India Company. And this permission was granted by Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb himself. And Sir Charles Eyre started construction near the bank of Hooghly River, and it was named after King William III in 1700. So why do we call it Fort William? It was named after King William III in 1700. So this is a very, very important thing that we need to remember. And in 1756, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, when he attacked the fort, temporarily he was able to conquer the city and changed its name to Sir John Goldsborough. It's a very, very important thing that we need to remember. So this led to the British to build a new fort in a place called Maidan. So Robert Clive therefore started rebuilding the fort in 1758 after the Battle of Plassey, as we all know, 1757. So when the Battle of Plassey took place in 1757, and later it was rebuilt in 1758, and the construction was completed in 1781. So what I'm trying to say is the Fort William therefore played very important role for the conquest and consolidation of Bengal. And interestingly, it has proverbially therefore obtained the designation of the lungs of Delhi, this particular Fort William. And it's very important. Siraj-ud-Dawla therefore challenged the East India Company. Now the fight between Siraj-ud-Dawla on the one side and the other side, the British East India Company. So Siraj-ud-Dawla therefore always wanted to destroy the Fort William, and because he had always under the impression that the British started misusing the Dastak and anytime Bengal may be under attack. So therefore he was always in defensive mode. So what is important here is Siraj-ud-Dawla therefore challenged the East India Company and started attacking Fort William with his 30,000 troops. So this is also a historically documented story. I'm not going into the details of the factual aspect of it. So in this struggle, the Nawab's army therefore was able to defeat the East India Company forces, and the Fort William therefore was conquered. The Nawab therefore filled the British prisoners into a small dark basement. The majority of prisoners therefore slowly suffocated to death. And there are scholars who claim that around 123 British soldiers died in this popular historical incident called Black Hole Tragedy. So this Black Hole Tragedy is a very important historical incident that took place in Bengal. Interestingly, as a person who has always have a kind of inquisitive attitude towards historical incidents, I just try to do a small research on this Black Hole Tragedy, right? So I was able to read some of the important interesting works of about this Black Hole Tragedy. One such important work that I was able to go through was Partha Chatterjee. So Partha Chatterjee's important work, The Black Hole of the Empire. I repeat the title, The Black Hole of the Empire. So those of you who have the provision to have access to all these readings, please go through it. I'm sure you'll be able to really enjoy the readings and the writings. And in this work, historian Partha Chatterjee argues that the history of British India began with this black hole incident. Let me make it very clear. He argues very persuasively that the history of British Empire in India began with this black hole incident. Okay, it's a very important argument. And he says, therefore, as a result, 123 persons died on the night of 20th June 1756 due to suffocation. And this was reported by John Holwell, governor of Fort William himself. So he has quoted, a considerable number of portions of the reports made by John Holwell. He was a governor of Fort William at that point in time. Okay, so now it's very important. The second study which I was able to go through by Nicholas Dirks. So Nicholas Dirks, in his very important work about the colonial conquest and consolidation, he has written a large number of books. One such important work I just wanted to use to contextualize the argument is a book titled The Scandal of Empire. The Scandal of Empire. Nicholas Dirks, The Scandal of Empire. And in this work, always remember, it's very, very intriguing to note that every school child in Britain came to know that the black hole atrocity of Calcutta. So what happened in 1756 therefore started spreading like wildfire in Britain. Even a small school-going kid is aware of what was going on in Bengal. And they also therefore came to know that there is something called black hole tragedy and black hole incident. And therefore this incident took place in 18 by 14 foot space, which had only two small windows. So this is the narration given by Nicholas Dirk in his book. So what exactly this black hole tragedy is all about? It's very important. He says that this black hole incident took place in the 18 by 14 foot space, which had only two small windows covered by iron rods, which restricted circulation of fresh air. And these British soldiers therefore were kept from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. Okay, this, when I was a student of history, I hardly knew what exactly the black hole tragedy. So when I was reading this, I was really amazed to know that how exactly this could have happened, right? So these soldiers therefore were kept from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. and it was the first major defeat of the East India Company in India. So the black hole tragedy therefore was the first defeat of the East India Company, and therefore this news reached Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, and different parts of the world, particularly London. As I told you, even school children in London were able to know what happened in 1756, particularly this black hole tragedy. So now it's very important. This black hole tragedy therefore created a kind of vengeance among the British, that they wanted to take revenge over this issue. And here comes a person called Robert Klein. Robert Klein, right? So Robert Klein was appointed as a writer in the East India Company. And if you read some of the important works about Robert Klein, you will understand that he did not like his job as a writer in the first place. And most notably, he attempted suicide twice, in 1725 and in 1747. Later he joined as a captain in the British Army, and 1755 he wanted to revenge Siraj-ud-Dawla. Always remember, now it's a politics of revenge. And now, as we all know, the Battle of Plassey was fought between Siraj-ud-Dawla and Robert Klein in June 1757. And some available literatures argue that only two generals of Siraj-ud-Dawla supported him, and three other generals therefore had supported the East India Company secretly. So here comes the historical turning point. So in this battle, therefore, Nawab's army led by Mir Jafar did not take part. Mir Jafar, always remember his name, Mir Jafar. So Mir Jafar therefore became a traitor in a way. So some historians would go to the extent to portray Mir Jafar as a jackal of Robert Klein. So it was actually a war between well-trained English army of 3,000 men and 50,000 not properly trained feudal army of Bengal Nawab. So as we all know, the end result, because it was a war between well-trained army and a feudal army which hardly has any skill about the armed forces. So nevertheless, the British were able to defeat the Nawab largely with the help of Mir Jafar. So Mir Jafar therefore played a very, very important role in this particular battle in support of the East India Company. And here I need to intervene. Why Mir Jafar was not able to support the Bengal Nawab? And Partha Chatterjee, in another important work, Empire and Nation, argues very clearly that if the treacherous Mir Jafar had not supported the East India Company, remember, Klein could not have won so easily. So now we need to see who was the culprit, real culprit, was the real person. So therefore it's very important, and Mir Jafar therefore played very, very significant role in support of the East India Company. This is what we understand from the history. So if you have any counter sources that Mir Jafar did not play any active role in support of Britain, you are most welcome. So what I have, therefore I can share. So Partha Chatterjee himself, in his work Empire and Nation, argues that if the treacherous Mir Jafar had not supported the East India Company, Robert Klein could not have won the Battle of Plassey so easily. So now it's very important. As a result, Siraj-ud-Dawla therefore was defeated in this Battle of Plassey. Now, as usual, we also need to know what are the consequences of the Battle of Plassey. Obviously, Mir Jafar, who was considered to be the jackal of Robert Klein, was given some kind of responsibility, right? He became a kind of puppet in the hands of East India Company, and an English army of about 6,000 soldiers was maintained in Bengal, because you know this is one of the most important implications of the Battle of Plassey. And as usual, resources of Bengal had been taken over by the East India Company. So here another important thing that we need to remember, how therefore the British, who were always having an eye for the economy of Bengal, therefore were able to enjoy the resources. And it was with the wealth of the Bengal, the English were able to defeat the influence of the French in South India. This is also another important, how Bengal therefore produced considerably huge amount of wealth, which was used by the British to defeat their rivals in different parts of India, particularly the French in South India. And another important implication of Battle of Plassey was that the trade of Bengal became the monopoly of the East India Company. And it marked therefore the beginning of economic exploitation or drain of wealth, which Dada Bhai Navroj used to identify. And therefore Clive became the governor of Bengal. This is also another important consequence. So what is important as from the perspective of conquest and consolidation, the 1757 therefore was the beginning of modern era, and the foundation of Britain, therefore British rule, was laid for the first time after the Battle of Plassey. So this is a very, very important thing that we need to remember. And another important thing that I wanted to discuss is, it is in this context we also need to see another important battle of Buxar. For example, Robert Clive also still playing a very, very important role, and it is the East India Company still trying to misuse the trading rights. They also sold trade permits illegally to the Indian merchants to get profit, and the Indian merchants therefore also carried out duty-free trade, largely because of the British. So these East India Company officials therefore started selling the right to trade to the Indian merchants. That's another important thing that we need to remember. And these Indian merchants therefore also carried out duty-free trade for their vested interest. And another important reason for the Battle of Buxar, therefore, was it led to a huge revenue loss for the Nawab of Bengal. As it's always important that Bengal always one of the richest provinces in India, and the illegal trade and the misuse of dust tax and the ways in which Britain continued to exploit the natural resources through different means, therefore, forced Bengal to go through a huge revenue loss. As a result, Nawab of Bengal therefore cancelled special permits which was given by the Mughals to the British. And this obviously provoked East India Company. So far as we were able to enjoy this special dust tax, and we won't be able to give it up, and therefore it created continuous conflicts between the Nawab of Bengal and the East India Company. So it was therefore in a way a conflict for sovereign power between the Nawabs of Bengal and the East India Company. So always remember, this is a very, very interesting story that we need to remember. The continuous conflicts and confrontations therefore led to Battle of Buxar. So in the Battle of Buxar, always we remember, it took place on October 22nd, 1764. It took place between two forces, the three alliance, Mir Qasim, Sujauddaulah and Shah Alam. Right? Mir Qasim was the successor of Nawab of Bengal, Sujauddaulah Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, who was the Mughal emperor during this time, was defeated therefore jointly by the British forces. Right, it is one of the very, very important turning points in the history of modern India. Battle of Plassey also was not successful for India, and Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buxar therefore strengthened the colonial power and dominance. As historian S.N. Sen in his study Advanced History of Modern India argues that during the course of the Battle of Buxar, Shah Alam II, who is the Mughal ruler during this point in time, surrendered to the British. And it's very important that the British not only took control over the Bengal but considerable parts of Bihar and Orissa. So always remember, it showed therefore a kind of supremacy of the English arms during these two important struggles. And obviously the end result is the Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buxar therefore led to a decline of Awadh and Mughal rulers, and it raised the political prestige of the British throughout India. That's another important historical development in this time, 1757 and 1764. And another thing that we need to remember, how the British were able to consolidate and conquer the whole of India, because they became unchallenged masters in Bengal, because the Nawab of Bengal was not able to deal with the East India Company's growth, and the Awadh rulers also were not able to deal with the dominance, the power of East India Company, and therefore you have a range of changes and challenges for these regional states, particularly Bengal and Awadh. And it's a very important, Shah Alam II therefore became a puppet again, and the Mughal ruler Shah Alam II and Robert Klein, it's very important development after the Battle of Buxar. Robert Clive and Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II therefore signed a treaty. This treaty, popularly known as Treaty at Allahabad, or Treaty of Allahabad. So obviously on 2nd August 1765, and according to this treaty, always remember, East India Company had the right to collect tax directly without the permission of the Mughal Emperor. So in return, they had to pay about 26 lakhs annually to the Mughals as a tribute. And Robert Clive made Shah Alam II as a pensioner of East India Company. Always remember, whenever a ruler was defeated, the ruler was made to be the pensioner, so that the message is very clear. So the ruler is always entitled to take rest forever. Okay, so in Bengal, Mir Jafar was appointed as Nawab of Bengal as a puppet. And similarly, Nawab of Awadh also was made to be a puppet of the East India Company. And what is interesting therefore is East India Company started collecting revenue directly. Military was under the control of East India Company. A small amount of revenue was handed over to Mir Jafar and who to run the administration. So now it's very important. As a result, it's very clear there was a dual government in Bengal was set up. Dual governance system. Dual governance system is a very, very important system. According to this system, the company, the East India Company, acquired the real power. What is exactly we need to remember? The British had all power and income, but no responsibility. So power, but no responsibility. As far as the rulers in these states, they have all responsibilities, but no power. I hope is it clear. I hope it is very, very interesting aspect of this system. So the British had all power and income, but no responsibility. And nevertheless, the responsibility of administration, therefore, was rested on the shoulders of Nawabs without any power and source of income. And interestingly, this dual system remained in practice from 1765 to 1772. So one intervention historically I wanted to make here, historian J.L. Mehta, who has studied extensively the history particularly of modern India, he argues, and he also makes a very interesting statement about the dual governance system which existed in Bengal, saying that the dual government in Bengal was the untold misery for the people of Bengal. Untold misery of the people of Bengal, and the company therefore proved to be the chief executive of the state. The East India Company therefore became the chief executive of the state, and unfortunately, the Nawab had no power to enforce law and justice. So this is a very, very important thing that we need to remember. This is how, therefore, Bengal and Awadh came under the power and dominance of the East India Company. So this is the story of Bengal. And the second important story that I have to discuss is how therefore Mysore was captured. Mysore's story is very, very interesting. So when we think of Mysore, two historical personalities come to our mind. One is Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. So sometimes they are seen in a good light and sometimes they are being demonized by politicians. I am not going into the details of the controversial aspect or the politics of the rulers. Rather, I would be trying to take a balanced view. So that's the beauty of a professional historian. If a historian takes one side and ideologically justify, I think he or she would be doing injustice to history. That's my personal take. So as a personal, as a professional historian, therefore, I would like to take a balanced view, the so-called positive and negative aspects of the rulers. So it's a very important that two important things that I need to remember: how historians therefore studied Mysore rulers, both Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. So both the figures are continue to be discussed by politicians differently. I am not going into that aspect now. And one important study, historian Sandeep Balakrishna. Okay, so he has done a very interesting study titled Tipu Sultan, the Tyrant of Mysore. So that title itself is a controversial title. How Tipu Sultan therefore can be identified as a tyrant of Mysore. And what is the source of his study? He has quoted extensively from the Malabar Manual or Gazetteers or some of the primary sources. After making a detailed study about Tipu Sultan, Sandeep Balakrishna comes to a conclusion that the Malabar Manual mentions that there are a large number of temples were destroyed by Tipu Sultan. Okay, this is also an argument which is debatable, but what he argues therefore also needs to be understood. And he also attempts to see Tipu Sultan as a traitor to the Kannada language. Kannada was the administrative language of the Mysore state under Udayars. So the Udayars were the rulers in Kannada for a considerable period of time. And here it's very important that the Udayars ruled that kingdom uninterruptedly from 1399 and 1947. Okay, it emerged as a feudatory principality in 1399 and which grew into the kingdom of Mysore. So he argues therefore this Kannada language was replaced with Parsi by Tipu Sultan. So this is also another important thing that we need to remember, why these things we need to see in a very historical and critical perspective. And Sandeep Balakrishna also argues that Tipu Sultan introduced Persian language as the medium of accounts in the revenue department. And he orders, therefore, the accounts to be submitted in Persian language. So introduction of Persian was aimed at helping Muslim scholars and popularize Persian language. So this is also one of the serious criticisms leveled against Tipu Sultan by some of the historians, including Sandeep Balakrishna. And secondly, on the contrary to Sandeep Balakrishna's and other historians' argument, you have historians who had taken a critical and some positive side about Tipu Sultan. For example, this interpretation, Sandeep Balakrishna's school of thought, therefore, was challenged by another important historian called S. Setar. Setar was the chairman of Indian Council of Historical Research, and he had studied detail about Mysore. And in his book, Archaeological History of Mysore, Tipu was one of the outstanding rulers of Mysore state. Secondly, he used Persian as his court language and employed Kannada for day-to-day administration. Okay, he's trying to deconstruct the argument made by Sandeep Balakrishna. And Setar also argues that if Tipu was discarded from the pages of history because his administration was bilingual, then it would become necessary to discard many other important rulers as well. Well, this is also a very intriguing argument to understand that Tipu was not the one and only ruler who has introduced bilingual language for the administrative convenience. And similarly, he also make little thought-provoking statement that hatred for Tipu was irrational, as there were no records to prove that he was against Kannada. Again, it is a debatable issue, because on the other side you have a group of scholars who say that he was against Kannada language, he was always in support of Persian language, and on the contrary, you have also scholars who said Tipu was never against Kannada language. So now the question is, how Mysore therefore came under the dominance and the power of British rule. For example, this South Indian state called Mysore was always under the rule by Wadayars, as I told you, and later by Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. So I don't want to go into the details of the facts and figures. I just try to give some important aspects of the struggles between the Mysore rulers and the East India Company. As we all know that there are 4 wars between the Mysore and East India Company, which is popularly identified as Anglo-Mysore Wars. Okay, so the first Anglo-Mysore War 1767, 1780 second, and the third one took place in 1790, and finally the Mysore was defeated completely by the East India Company in 1799. Here I would like to say something about the Mysore, and from historians' perspective. Just a brief historiography. What exactly Mysore was all about? How the Mysore was able to be annexed by the East India Company. And it's very important that historian Sima Alavi, of course, argues that Mysore state under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan was a centralized of Mysore under these 2 rulers was a centralized state. When we say centralized state, we mean that it had a kind of elaborate tax collecting bureaucracy and a powerful army trained by French military forces, right? And secondly, you have historian David Washbrook, a very, very important work on merchants, markets, and commerce in early modern South India. And he also argues that there was a strong relationship between the regional rulers such as Tipu Sultan and the privileged elites such as Mirasidars. So this is very, very important that in the beginning the relationship seemed to be a cordial, but later it was turned out to be contradictory. So it is very important that Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali were not able to maintain a kind of cordial relationship with the privileged sections. So as David Washbrook argues, it resulted in considerable gains for the lesser privileged and laboring groups. So this is a very, very, very important. How therefore there was a kind of disconnection between the privileged sections and the ruling Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. And the third important scholar I need to emphasize here is Burton Stein. And in his important study, Peasant State and Society in Medieval South India, essays on South India, he makes a very, very powerful argument, saying that Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan encouraged peasant agriculture and eliminated middlemen like Mirazidas and Jenmis. So what I'm trying to suggest here is, on the one side you have centralized state system, on the other side there was not cordial relationship between the state and the privileged section. On the contrary, you have a cordial relationship between the state and the peasant agriculture. So it's very, very, very important. And the fourth important scholar that I would like to emphasize here is Irfan Habib. So he has edited a very interesting volume titled Confronting Colonialism, Resistance and Modernization under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Resistance and Modernization under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. This is a very, very important study. And in this work, Irfan Habib and other scholars try to make a convincing conclusion saying that there was an increasing tendency towards centralization of revenue administration, right? So there was a centralization of revenue administration, and secondly, they began eliminating intermediaries. This is also a point jointly argued by other scholars. So this system of revenue, therefore, over a period of time, became the basis, obviously, for Monroe's Rayatwari system. So another important thing that is crucial here is Irfan Habib also argues in the same book, Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan of Mysore received occasional support from the French. So this is a fact and very established fact that needs to be remembered. So therefore, it's very important. Hyder Ali was a military commander under Hindu Udayar, king of Mysore, and he removed the Hindu king and became ruler of Mysore in 1761, and he attacked Malabar and captured Calicut, the capital of Malabar, in 1766. So Hyder Ali therefore became enemy number one for the British in South India, because Hyder Ali always wanted to capture and consolidate his power in South India, and this was not at all acceptable to the British. As I told you, Hyder Ali wanted to extend his authority to other parts of South India, including Madras. Obviously, it was not liked by his enemies like English, Marathas and Nizams of Hyderabad. So now you have, therefore, four important wars between the Mysore kings, Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, and the British East India Company. So it's a very important, therefore, that finally Mysore came under the British rule in 1799. So 1799, it's a very, very important period in the history of India, because in this fourth Anglo-Mysore War, always remember, as I told you, there were four Anglo-Mysore Wars, and Mysore therefore was captured by the East India Company in 1799. So one thing here, it's very important to be noted. So Mysore ruler was forced to accept the British forces in the fourth Anglo-Mysore War, and as a result, Tipu Sultan was forced to pay money for the maintenance of forces. So the British government, as a result, reinstated Udayar king, and Mysore became part of the British. Always remember, it's very important. After the fourth Anglo-Mysore War, Mysore was not directly annexed and consolidated by the British, but the ruler actually who was ruling Mysore, Udayar king, was in a way a sympathizer of the East India Company, and as a result, Mysore became part of the British East India Company in 1799, but Udayar king was the actual ruler, and Consequently, the British East India Company established military supremacy of the British in Mysore, and it became an integral part of the East India Company. So this is a very, very important thing that we need to remember. As a result, a British resident was placed in Mysore. Remember how Bengal was captured, and how Bengal therefore became an integral part of the British East India Company. And the second one, which was in line, was also Mysore. So as a result, a British resident was placed, and most importantly, the Kingdom of Mysore remained a princely state, not directly under the British East India Company until 1947, when it chose to join the Indian Union. So here it is a very, very important story that we need to remember. And the third important state that we need to think is the conquest of Marathas. So Marathas always played a very, very important role in the history of India. And as we all know, the Maratha Empire was founded by Chhatrapati Shivaji in 1764. And always remember, Marathas followed a kind of guerrilla war method. By the middle of 18th century, the Marathas had emerged as the most powerful power group in India. But in 1761, it's a very important development. Maratha army lost the third battle of Panipat against Ahmad Shah Abdali of Afghan. So therefore, this stopped the imperial expansion of Marathas into Afghanistan. So this led to a kind of political instability. So remember, always it's a very important to note that when Chhatrapati Shivaji was in power, it reached the maximum growth in terms of power and politics. But after Shivaji, the Mughal and the Marathas started declining. The power of Marathas started declining, and this therefore led to political instability in Marathas. So for example, there are many reasons for the decline or failure of Marathas. For one such important reason is because the English took a kind of advantage of the disunity between the Maratha rulers. So after Shivaji, always remember, when Shivaji was in power, there was a kind of perfect order, law and order in the society. There was a kind of unity in the society. There was always a kind of united resistance. There was a huge army. There was a guerrilla warfare system. But after Shivaji, you find a series of challenges and weaknesses started coming up. And after Shivaji, therefore, Marathas had no efficient leaders, right? And no sound economic policy. And the modern military techniques, therefore, helped British to defeat the Marathas. And here, one important study that you can think of is historian Metcalfe. In his study, A Concise History of Modern India, argues that after the defeat at Panipat, I emphasize here, after the defeat of the Marathas at Panipat, Marathas got divided into 5 states. What are these 5 states? Number 1, Pune, Baroda, Gwalior, Indore, and Nagpur. So always remember, when you are in unity, the enemy's task becomes very tough. So when there is disunity, the enemy can defeat you without much power and force. So what happened in Marathas, therefore, in Marathas, the lack of unity, lack of centralization, lack of trained army after Shivaji, at the time, therefore, continuous conflicts for power, conflicts for privilege, and there were therefore always conflicts between the rulers of Marathas. So that is one of the most important reasons for the British to defeat the Marathas in the 18th century. So, for example, here you have three Anglo-Maratha wars. I'll just explain the years. And the first Anglo-Maratha War, 1775, 1782. The second Anglo-Maratha was 1803, 1805. And the third Anglo-Maratha War, 1817 to 1818. So therefore, what I am trying to suggest is by 1818, the entire Maratha territory were annexed by the East India Company. So two historical interventions that I would like to make here about the nature of conquests of British about the Marathas. So historian S.P. Verma, in his book, A Study of Maratha Diplomacy, so the title itself speaks a lot about how there was a kind of diplomacy in the Marathas. He argues in this book, A History, A Study in Maratha Diplomacy, how the diplomacy of the East India Company helped them defeat the Marathas. So one of the most important tools adopted by the East India Company was, according to S.P. Verma, was diplomacy. So diplomacy therefore played an important role as far as the conquest and consolidation of Marathas. And secondly, you also have a historian S.N. Sen. S.N. Sen, in his book Anglo-Maratha Relations, Anglo-Maratha Relations, argues that the administration of Warren Hastings suggests that the military supremacy of the East India Company led to the decline of Marathas. Always remember there are two important factors how the British were able to consolidate their power and position in Maratha kingdom. Was one is diplomacy. So always they try to make advantage of the divisive nature which was deeply embedded in Maratha state. And secondly, the British meticulously used their military supremacy to defeat the Marathas. So therefore, what we need to remember here is, the main important reason for the conquest and consolidation of Britain in India was diplomacy, and secondly, the most important reason was military superiority. So it's a very, very intriguing to note that from 1818 onwards, the British East India Company were able to rule Marathas directly. So always remember, it's a very important thing to be noted, how therefore Marathas came under the direct control of the East India Company. What happened in 1818 therefore? The Peshwas, considered to be the prime minister in the modern use of the term, surrendered before the British in 1818, and as a result, Peshwa Bajirao II was granted pension. Remember, this pension issue was very popular among the East India Company administrative reasons. When Bengal was annexed and captured, its ruler was given pension, and the Mughal ruler was given pension. And thirdly, you have a classic example how Peshwa Bajirao II was granted pension after he was defeated. So therefore, it's very important. The history of the post of Peshwa was defeated, was abolished in fact after the Third Anglo-Maratha War, and Marathas became an integral part of the British. So it's very important. Percival Spear, in his book, The Oxford History of India, argues, therefore, The most central and western Indian states were once tributary states to the Marathas made subsidiary alliances with the British. Remember, once these states considered to be most powerful were made to be subsidiary alliances, were made to have subsidiary alliances with the British. So this is how, therefore, the British were able to capture and consolidate their power and position in Marathas. And the fourth important case study that I would like to mention briefly is the British conquest of Punjab, how the Britain was able to capture and consolidate its power in Punjab. I begin with a very, very interesting statement made by an Austrian traveler. He used to visit Punjab when Ranjit Singh was the ruler of Punjab, right? This Austrian traveler, Charles Barron, in his book Travels in Kashmir and Punjab, made a very, very interesting observation. You know what is that observation? The state established by Ranjit Singh was the most wonderful place in the whole world. I repeat, the state established by Ranjit Singh was the most wonderful place in the whole world. This is a very, very interesting, and possibly it may be an exaggerated statement as well. So now we need to remember something about the state of Punjab, how it was powerful, how later it was made to be a colony, or how it was captured by the British. Remember that it was the 10th Guru Gobind Singh who created a strong military power, and when Maharaja Ranjit Singh was the ruler, he made himself an efficient ruler of Punjab. So when we think of Punjab, the first person who comes to our mind is Ranjit Singh, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And one of the most important works that you can think of reading is J.S. Grewal. J.S. Grewal has done a very, very important work, particularly about the Punjab region. And he argues, therefore, in his book, The Six of the Punjab. Okay, this is a very important work. Those of you who want to study, you can go to this important work, J.S. Grewal, The Six of the Punjab. And in this book, he argues that the unification of the Sikh Empire began during Ranjit Singh. 1792 to 1839 was his period. And he trained his army like the East India Company. So why it is important? Okay. The role played by Ranjit Singh, therefore, is important because he was able to train his army like the East India Company. That's number one. And second, he conquered Lahore in 1799 to make Lahore his capital. And thereafter, he conquered a series of places like Amritsar, Ludhiana, Multan, Kashmir, Peshawar, and other places. So the main geographical boundaries of Punjab to Khyber Pass in the west, to Kashmir in the north, to Sindh in the south, and Tibet in the east. So this is a very, very important thing that needs to be understood, how the geographical boundary was expanded when Ranjit Singh was in power. And what is his policy? Ranjit Singh always followed the policy of non-aggression with the British, and he made a treaty with the British known as Treaty of Amritsar in 1809. So always remember, he always had a kind of cordial relationship with the East India Company. So according to this Treaty of Amritsar, Ranjit Singh was acknowledged as the sovereign ruler, and Ranjit Singh in turn accepted the political domination of the British up to River Satluj. Always remember. So there was a mutual agreement between the two forces. Ranjit Singh accepted the sovereignty of the British, and the British rulers therefore accepted that Ranjit Singh can rule in Punjab as a sovereign ruler. Now the question is, the boundaries of British Empire in India extended up to the River Satluj. Always remember. And the story is going like this. Ranjit Singh dies in 1839, and which led to, like any other kingdom, led to a series of struggles of succession. And within 10 years of his death, the Sikh Empire was taken over by the English, and Ranjit Singh therefore his son Dalip Singh became the ruler in 1843. So always remember, Ranjit Singh's son Dalip Singh became the ruler of 1843 in 1843. So now it's very important. On 11th December 1845, Dalip Singh crossed Satluj River. Always remember, according to the treaty signed in 1809, no one is supposed to cross Satluj River. So here Dalip Singh crosses Satluj River and attacked the British. So the British declared a war on Lahore. So this led to the first Anglo-Sikh War. So this led to the Anglo-Sikh War. So always remember, it's a power, the conflict of power, it's a conflict power position, and the conflict for geographical annexation, which led to the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So in fact, there are 3 Anglo-Sikh Wars. It's very important. The First Anglo-Sikh War therefore came to an end with a treaty called Treaty of Lahore. According to this treaty, Dalip Singh agreed to give important agricultural lands to the British. Always remember, the British therefore wanted to capture, because they felt that the treaty was violated. The treaty was violated by the ruler Dalip Singh. So, and it's very important, Dalip Singh also promised to pay a war indemnity or compensation to the British. And similarly, a British resident was posted in Lahore to control the duties of every department. So this is a very, very important thing that we need to remember. And similarly, the Treaty of Amritsar also was signed on 16th March 1846. Just it's a very, very important thing as far as Kashmir. The contemporary history of Jammu and Kashmir can be traced back to this Treaty of Amritsar, which was signed on 16th March 1846. So this was signed between the British government and the Maharaja Gulab Singh. Okay, I'm not talking about Dalip Singh, I'm talking about Gulab Singh. So what is the significance of this treaty? This treaty also was followed by the first Anglo-Sikh War. Accordingly, Kashmir was sold to Gulab Singh just for 75 lakhs rupees. Always remember, Kashmir was sold to Gulab Singh just for 75 lakhs of rupees. Who was this Gulab Singh? He was the Dogra chieftain of the Sikh kingdom of Punjab. So now the fact of the matter is, Kashmir was given to Gulab Singh for his neutrality during Anglo-Sikh War. Always remember, British always used to give a kind of gift to those who support them in the war. So similarly, the British felt that this Gulab Singh, he was not in support of the Punjab, and obviously it was taken as an indirect support extended to the British. So British wanted to give this particular ruler a kind of return gift. Right. So now Kashmir was given to Gulab Singh for his neutrality during Anglo-Sikh War. As a result, a Hindu family was able to establish its rule over Muslim-dominated Kashmir for the first time. And Gulab Singh therefore became the first ruler of Jammu and Kashmir. As I told you, 1846 could be possibly be identified as the history of modern Jammu and Kashmir. And Gulab Singh possibly agreed to pay a kind of annual tribute to the British, which also included Kashmiri shawls. Always remember, this is a very, very interesting story, how therefore there was a cordial relationship between the East India Company and the ruler at Kashmir. So the Second Anglo-Mysore War therefore fought in 1848 and 49. So between Sikhs and the East India Company forces. So this is a very, very important thing. There are many reasons for the Second Anglo-Mysore War, Anglo-Sikh War. So here it's very, very interesting aspect is, this also has been pointed out by J.S. Grewal and others, that British did not capture the whole of Punjab but humiliated the Sikh army. Okay, sometimes humiliation in the history was taken as serious historical error. So therefore, as J.S. Grewal argues, that British did not capture the whole of Punjab after the first Anglo-Sikh War, but humiliated the Sikh army. So the Sikh army therefore had to retaliate and react. What is that humiliation? For example, the Sikh ruler of Lahore, Maharani Jindan Kaur, was removed by the British resident on conspiracy charges against the resident. And secondly, second important humiliation faced by the Punjab rulers was that the Punjab ruler at Multan named Mulraj was removed by the British resident again, since he demanded increased revenues. So always remember this, the notion of humiliation therefore was taken up seriously by the Punjab rulers, and this led to conflicts and confrontations between the Punjab rulers and the East India Company. So Sikh forces therefore joined together and fought the British. A number of revolts therefore took place in 1848 and 49, and the final battle was fought at a place called Gujarat, not the modern Gujarat that we are talking about. The spelling of Gujarat is Gujrat, Gujarat. It was a Punjab province of Pakistan, modern Pakistan. So on 21st February 1849. So what is the significance of this important battle? The East India Company forces therefore were able to get support from Bengal and Bombay presidencies. Always remember, this Bengal and Bombay presidency supported the East India Company a lot when East India Company was in war with the Punjab. I just imagine if they had not supported, if the forces or East India Company forces of the Bengal presidency and the Bombay presidency, if they have not supported the East India Company during this time, I don't think that the East India Company would have defeated the Punjab kingdom, the Punjab rulers. So this is very, very important, that when there was a crucial stage of struggle between the Punjab rulers and the East India Company in 1849, particularly in February 1849, the Sikh forces were defeated by the East India Company forces, jointly by the Indian forces of Bengal and Bombay presidencies on the one side, and the Sikh and Afghan forces on the other side. So the story is very clear how therefore there was a joint struggle between the East India Company on the one side and the Sikh and Afghan forces on the other side. But the fact of the matter is the East India Company was supported by the Indian forces of Bengal and Bombay presidencies. And I think, therefore, this could be one of the reasons why the East India Company was able to defeat the powerful Sikh army. The end result is Major General Hug Go fought the Sikh general, and the whole Punjab was therefore annexed in March 1849. The whole Punjab was annexed by the East India Company in March 1849. And as we all know, John Lawrence was appointed as the first commissioner of Punjab. John Lawrence was appointed as the first commissioner of Punjab. So what I therefore explain today is how the British forces were able to capture and consolidate their power in 4 important regional states. One is Bengal, and another important state the British was able to capture was Mysore, and the third important state captured by the British was Marathas, and finally Punjab also became a state ruled by the East India Company. I just try to give some important aspects of the conquest and consolidation. So those of you who want to know more about the British conquest and consolidation, please go through the books which I have referred to in the discussion, and I'm sure you will be able to know more, and you will be able to know everything in detail. So what I said is only a little aspect of the discussion. So there are many things that you can read, understand. I'm sure you also need to be critical and historical in terms of your understanding. So let's not go by any particular ideology. Let's not go by any particular historical interpretation. As professional historians, always try to understand both the sides. If you are talking about only one side of the story, I'm sure we will be doing injustice to history. As professional historians, I am again reiterating that we always need to go in details of multiple aspects, be it personalities or states and so on and so forth. I thank once again for all of you for taking your valuable time and for joining this wonderful discussion. So if you have any queries, questions and comments, you are most welcome, and you can write your comments in the Facebook, and let's be in touch, and we will learn a lot by reading and writing history, because history is always interesting. For me, history is the most interesting subject among all subjects. You know why? It is a continuous process of interaction between past and present, and it is an unending dialogue between we historians and our facts. Therefore, history will live forever. Thank you so much for taking your valuable time.